sisit kakiokiwapatin utiaski notikimiwan kutak ukisigaw akami mo kawititin itos kutsita namoya kosta Towin ita mitsitsi makikwe matuin kaya kustatsi kutak ukisigaw
Masina kan kakinopat naman 1740s, 1760s. Utstaw isa egisiniga asut kitsansin ni no ugimaw. Kanagatsisi tansin no kuesagi kiskani tage setai se matsi isut. Kuese kusisi kami no to tansin no. Utstaw ugimaw esa egisiniga atit kitsansin ni no. Attimes tässä agetimes kutsipan expik katitipeni tagu te meswe moniao. Expik katitipeni meguago samis tai naspitsi ugebagan ke atisiniga tigaino.
Kiniganim no go maspinwega gipn Kiskinwahama sutzigoma egutego pisigiat na nagatita tsigegoma munyawe pingewen.
Eguspigo bagagi punnotun tokigone naspitsi egusi siansin no kiat nagatiso meswechegi siwapata agamaskik papituste egi pamituta te pamintuta maget. Igoni kai tagi pegiaute ut. Egusisi naspitsi kiatti mames kutsipanugevan.
1918 egutego expigis noten toma World War I Mohawk Indian Lieutenant Frederick Loft egogi nakskuo Privy Council egwas tikitsugmaga noma. Egutagimam skutamok eguma kigwa pagamska gut gaisap na nehioscam gauma minste Canada egwegutta December 20th, 1918 Loft egwawa kimatsitaguma Indian League of Canada egutewi wautaskiwa Six Nations Reserve Ontario.
A lot of that movement to allow First Nations students to get into the mainstream school system, to get out of the residential school system, which was horrific, came from the returning soldiers, both the World War I and World War II. My grandfather was in both wars. And so when they went overseas and they got to travel outside the reserve, they saw the way the rest of the world was. And they saw the freedoms and rights that other Canadians had and other people around the world had. And so they were able to study their own situation in a broader comparative context and see how terribly they were being treated, how marginalized they were, and how discriminated against they were, how little access they had to education and employment opportunities and things like that. So they started to lobby for changes in the Indian Act.
Aya ego 1930s ego tek spio mewe gisnuten toagam ga World War II ego nego go smagan siga nagoma gigakwe tigemo ego ma pass system tanege magoma ega pagitni tigoma tapnagatag ego meskun gun.
The Indian Act was a really oppressive piece of legislation. You know, it had prohibited a lot of our ceremonies. It had the compulsory residential school attendance thing. It imposed the chief and council system on us, and even your chief and council had to be approved by the Indian agent.
1944 Percy report mas naiganama kipm gaganoapm go wapito go san matan siwisto sipm gaktimak sigoma 1947 peace we suo en kiusi tsigateo tapm Kiskinwahama sute wapito go sanoma provincial school systems egotex in the 50s.
Indians weren't allowed to go to public schools until around 1948. They were denied access because schools fell under provincial jurisdiction. which is why most of them in that era only got a grade 8 education that they were able to get at residential school or at the few remaining day schools.
Stop po kumakain na ego si siya ni magagi pitikatachik 1951 ego ta Indian Act ko tago si tao.
Indian Affairs up to that point only concerned itself with grade 1 to 8 and then eventually to grade 12. And it didn't even develop any grade 12 programming per se. They just developed transfer agreements to the provinces to allow Indian students to go into provincial schools.
Et papigis ko atachika ego tagagi pitikat peer true. Yung ani peer true ga pitikat mistake chika ita mag 1968 an sinya kago si petego esta siya pinagani an kita.
Ego tamage ego gagiatan stona gikpe ego munya o gigikwe pamingo ago goma.
Ego spiko tini na first get tia au na peo Jean Chrétien kita. Itai sa po ga itsa yo taga punagista was prime minister. Ego spiko ni ma ka pitikat sika tega ni ma white paper 1969. Wah kigus ko ni ganin no. Ewaut negate ni gutaskia ya ko ni ganin no.
1969 egutam ego gap na nehio scum goma Saskatchewan egip mames kutai data mioma ego magapm gaganopa tamix na masuin ego mina gapm paita maso ego tamanten ego esus kwatsen tanigi mamitset nano epmsitos kami ego mo uta Minster Canada. Nehia na tege smwatski toge go motum masnaigan white paper policy National Indian Brotherhood agawi wagi kinati stoe oge gweneho liberala ego tego ki paskia we ogoma ego tego wistoga ki pita go tatsugoma red paper policy.
So our grandfather explained to us when we were young what the treaty negotiations were all about and what the ideas were and the agreements were concerning education. And it was when the old people and the leaders went into negotiations for the treaty, their position was that we weren't giving up our traditional education systems, that we would hang on to that. And there was no discussion at treaty negotiations that our education system would be taken away from us at all. So what they negotiated for was that we would hang on to our system, but we would also have access to the cunning of the white man, and that the federal government, the Dominion government at that time, agreed to provide education to all First Nations people, equivalent to any education available to Canadians. About the mid-70s, the education First Nations people received was the education package that the federal government and even some of the churches still provided. And so the quality of education wasn't great. And First Nations across Canada were saying that we can do this ourselves. And so the big Indian control of Indian education movement started afoot in the late 60s, early 70s, and culminated in a position paper called Indian Control of Indian Education that was presented to Ottawa in the early 70s.
Ya ti mames kutue pin gewa egunu te aimi hawan mga kip magoteg wix knama to gamgo pito se gwetege egune he oge katagax knama su gamgo ge separate schools guy to ma public schools ya patage. Egutego pamnamaso axknamasuan, egutoma 1969 wiega keep mai twe eguno te tanana patsita no tapngaginetama egumanehiawe when egwaschi aimuan.
When you go to residential school, you just drop your language. I mean, you had a lot of help dropping your language. And I think it would be very good if we, at different areas like the Indian education and so on, there should be other components besides what we can learn from the white person teaching us, from there.
Egutego atusko epingeoma, egutego ka keep mai tamo kete sagoma kete egwiwao, tapngaxknamagwa kegunehiawe when egopik squewen, egutansi pesip matsipetsnawe.
When you go to residential school, you have that break from your own family. Well, maybe up to sometimes for 13 years, you don't interact with your family, and you leave home. And all through those years, a lot of us missed our adolescent years because we were spent in the residential schools. So we didn't know how to live in between there.
Ne hiawe when ego magaisan stoetami, egutam expiga egip magawatami tawainamo.
1972, in Stam, Tagyo Sichira Tikumuta, Saskatchewan Indian Culture Center. Eguaya, Egoba mo at Stamoma, the first one Nathan. Ekyo Sichira Tiga is an institute at the provincial level that serves First Nations. Egome egomam ne mo at nika Ekyo Sichira Tik, Ogmahan, Ekyo Sitachik. Ako sit to kumaya and I got to hima. Gomenaya Pusita, Kawistas Humaga, in an area of language, big school nano.
Pegan mi napita ko sana. Apita ko sana kagut kiao pegnapio 1969 the outsiders kitsaga teonama 180 mik igapu mamitrene mi tapita ko sana ko sis.
Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, Niguno, Mamutsun Stamma Gisanan Stoimi, Tigwe Métis Society of Saskatchewan, we stole mas bin 1960s Gakip Mamatsu Epingetsik. Egwats, we 1982 apito go sana mapegon o skitsuino gakis kaknoap mitama we suoni. Egutam ego gakip mamatsita tsegego ma Métis National Council 1983 tapum papik squesta masu tsigo mawisto apito go sanak. Kipik squata moge gutex pioma ego matosita Métis Rights Agenda takwe witsi tigwista wow.
The political relations between the Métis Society and the province of Saskatchewan were quite strained because for a number of reasons. There was a number of social economic issues that we had put before government, and it didn't seem that they were listening. And it was brought to our attention at one point that the Prime Minister of Canada would be meeting with all of the premiers in Waskesiu. So we blockaded the roads into Waskesiu. There was approximately 500 people that showed up. Shortly thereafter, the province of Saskatchewan agreed to sit down with the Métis Society of Saskatchewan.
Tagiso kutsita pokki go mata kwento takke gune hote government apito go sana guisto tapeta tsego makiwa pagam skagutsik ego mateke sexkna masun atoskiawan eksekigwa isa. 1970s works pisak toago mo te apito go sanak ki kwegatna mokego mawisto tapam na masu sexkna matogamgo.
Government high well, you can pay our own school. We wanted our own board to be in place. And that's where the Matsinotin to act out. It was the church versus the Métis Society of Saskatchewan, I guess you would say at that time. And the fight was on. I think the power base was starting to shift more to the community, going away from like Smagansak, Ugimawak, Dakter, Wayos.
We waoke, egunigo ke kakip na niganista ke kumaksknama suan.
Ekte gamats notin toto. Yo apahta ko that yo anihta to their group of people. Ne we wan me we o na to hit itaguako.
Egu mapugotagi koe pampaitama sumak skinamasuan. Egu ne ho te onigani ogo makinstone mokeko o te petsna we tapngaganapat mi motigak skinamatikques utoasum suawa.
Now, Indian Affairs has always taken a position that they don't acknowledge university as a treaty right. Indian Affairs has always taken the position that, and their position is based on a literal interpretation of the treaties, that their treaty obligation is only to provide elementary school education, all that which would have been available in a little schoolhouse in the country. Their position is they weren't responsible for post-secondary. And of course that's totally the opposite of what a lot of our oral historians tell us about our treaty rights to education.
Ego magakip matoskata kigaita wanita big square win ego wano skip mo apatenano emiasik. Sknamasun mantunigip magawata mitap tatagagasta anutse wagakisigak ay muwin nehia wewen astil kiskinamatu kamgo.
Kiskinamagi ako ma nihido yun kanida macho yun kiskinamatu kamgo. Widoch chita pogo kami na tasitos ka chagawasak kispin ko machitana no nido big square minna nido machihuin nanto nisap kawichatos kimagaw tatoskiok migoach yatoskata ko kiskinawatas na igan tapmitsa ko kiskinamagiok tatahtoaskiwin awassagi moni hutuchik tisni daw nagamuchik tanani hiduischik ito namin awassagat mididihtamok inihidawchik kamina nani hiduischik kamina unigigwawa mididihtamitoa.
I've never had one Aboriginal teacher as old as I am, you know, took lectures and all that. Teachers were and they never put themselves up to learn our language, so we had to learn theirs.
Nehia na pitogusan na kapampaitayak sknamaswin etimaskosimaga. Egu megip magawata migiano ok sknamage waktapngak sknamuatsig kitsuasum sinuag.
People had entering into universities in the 70s was that they weren't adequately prepared. The on-reserve education they received was of pretty low quality, and so they were having a really difficult time in the university system. Also, there wasn't a whole lot of First Nations graduates out of high school back then. So that's when the TEP programs emerged.
Well, ITEP actually, we like to think of it as a result of the 1969 Indian control of education. We were probably the first program in Canada to take on the challenge of developing and implementing a First Nations teacher education program. Enrollment escalated from 21 students to over 186. Our numbers right now average approximately 185, 200 students per year.
So at the same time where you've got First Nations communities taking over funding programs, you've got Indian Affairs capping the money. See, so there's a couple of things happening here. Just as the numbers start to increase, Indian Affairs caps the money. And as soon as First Nations start taking control over administering their own programs, Indian Affairs caps the money.
Apitogosana ke wistuau exumegikweso epingewak.
An idea was formed in 1976 at an Amnesis educational conference. A group of Métis and non-status people got together and felt it was necessary to create a Métis-specific institution. And part of the thinking of the day was there was a recognition at the time that mainstream institutions were not meeting the needs of First Nations and Métis peoples. This was evident if we looked at many of the socio-economic indicators of the time. Métis people at that time felt that if we had a Métis-specific organization and was Métis-controlled and constituted with our values and culture, that we could improve those numbers and we could more equitably participate in the Canadian and Saskatchewan economies by preparing our people for jobs and allowing them to earn an income for their family.
1976, segutego santepka kip mamatsi tauma, wiwa ogegonu tapito sano asaguma questa quegaxkinamatsiguma moitapskutspetzanawe.
Within our SUNTEP program, we would have 180 students per year, and typically we would have a graduating class of around 15 to 20. Throughout its history, SUNTEP has graduated over 700 students, which is a very powerful number when one starts to think about it.
Giwet no Saskatchewan noma Northern Teacher Education Program igip mamatsita egwegutama minuntinigitagago epingeogoma tinim no tapn sa Sapohtew tapn gakskinamagetsig.
Gipoyan ITEP in 1980. Kawed gipitohtan SUNTEP iponihtayan ma the Bachelor of Education degree. Wekuta namatsix nama gaano ta Nortep. Kagiopigyan maka pix nama soyan namagigwe nihio snamagiwak nigiwap mawak egotsin ya kagigawat tamanoma the taksnamagian.
Good morning, everyone. And it's interesting that the earliest university graduates were educators. They came out of education faculties, they came out of social work faculties, or they came out of the ministry.
So more and more we're gaining control over our own lives. We have a long way to go yet, but you know, it's changed, you know, substantially. I can remember in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, when there were meetings, you know, the white people, the conservation officers, other people in authority would go to the front and they would run our meetings, and our people really were more subservient. They, although they didn't like maybe the way things were happening, they weren't overly vocal, but so the Métis people basically have achieved that sense of, I guess, decolonization, if you can call it that. So it is a massive change.
Kap mameskutsuepin gego mantanepin tatagage itami epim sasitoskato. Epim sugastai tegap moawige egwaxknamasu no makiapitsip maagamemo.
Well, First Nations University of Canada was, as you know, it was called Saskatchewan Indian Federated College back in 1976 when it started. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations had seen the need for First Nation university graduates and saw that very few people were getting through the other universities, and so they had for several years really tried to find a partner that would work with them to develop a First Nations university.
1976, Ida Wasakes, Wiegokiai Manioma, Utatuskiwanoma, SIFC Takwe, Matsue Pinge, Egutamegi Moitap Sumaga, FSIN, Wiawiwao, Takip Kakanopum, Gutsigomax Ganamasuan.
Weski Tigaskitao, Skoniganino, Utauchi, Saskatchewan, Kaitigate. Mistai, Suganetagaganita, Negosisi. Utstau kitsansin ni no sisiga mamait kaskitao tasugigapais tagere umotaga no patama Kiskinwahama utstapu kaya te egipap mamitrenita mi got kitsansin ni no anutsio gi opatera no Sapohtew kichigaskita wago Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations kai tichi kawitatus kai ma chigui chansin ni no kaskita ge Sapohtew chiguma kaya teuchi tipamatuin treaty rights kai chigate egu tauchi pandiguma kasugime kakere mistake chigaskitano.
And it's only been in the past 20 years, really, that you've got a new generation that's expanding beyond education, social work, and the ministry. So in the past 20 years, you've got this wonderful diversity of First Nations graduates from engineering, from medicine, from dentistry, from history, from anthropology, archaeology, economics. And you've only seen that phenomenon recently. It's a really new phenomenon, so that many of the people of my generation, for example, were the first Indians to graduate in their graduate programs. First Nations people and education is still a really fresh new history.
Mr. Hey, Kiskinwahama, Wapake Kawapatino, Wahyo Ipimutia. Kutak ukisigaw, niwats niyo matsihon.